There was neither glow of tenderness, of regret, nor of memory in her eyes. Her smile was wan and forced. He knew that she was calling upon his chivalry to forget that one moment before the door of her tent. He bowed and said simply: "I'm afraid you didn't sleep well, Josephine. Did I disturb you when I stole out of camp?" "I heard nothing," she replied. "Nothing but the cries of that terrible bird out on the lake. I'm afraid I didn't sleep much." The atmosphere of the camp that morning weighted Philip's heart with a heaviness which he could not throw off. He performed his share of the work with Jean and tried to talk to him, but Croisset would only reply to his most pointed remarks. He whistled. He shouted out a song back in the timber as he cut an armful of dry birch, and he returned to Jean and the girl, laughing, the wood piled to his chin and the axe under his arm. Neither showed that they had heard him. The meal was eaten in a chilly silence that filled him with deepest foreboding. Josephine seemed at ease. She talked with him when he spoke to her, but there seemed now to be a mysterious restraint in every word that she uttered. She excused herself before Jean and he were through, and went to her tent. A moment later Philip rose and went down to his canoe. In the rubber sack was the last of his tobacco. He was fumbling for it when his heart gave a great jump. A voice had spoken softly from behind him. "Philip." Slowly, unbelieving, he turned. It was Josephine. For the first time she had called him by his name. And yet the speaking of it seemed to put a distance between them, for her voice was calm and without emotion, as she might have spoken to Jean. "I lay awake nearly all of the night, thinking," she said. "It was a terrible thing that we did, and I'm sorry sorry." In the quickening of her breath he saw how heroically she was fighting to speak steadily to him. "You can't understand," she resumed, facing him with the steadiness of despair. "You cannot understand until you reach Adare House, and that is what I dread, the hour when you will know what I am, and how terrible it was for me to do what I did last night. If you were like most other men I wouldn't care so much. But you have been different." He replied in words which he would not dare to have uttered a few hours before. "And yet, back there, when you first asked me to go with you as your husband, you knew what I would find at Adare House?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "You knew?" "Yes." "Then what has produced the change that makes you fear to have me go on? Is this because" he leaned toward her, and his face was bloodless "is it because you care a little for me?" "Because I respect you, yes," she said in a voice that disappointed him. "I don't want to hurt you. I don't want you to go back into the world thinking of me as you will. You have been honest with me. I do not blame you for what has happened last night. The fault was mine. And I have come to you now so that you will understand that no matter how I may appear and act, I have faith and trust in you. I would give anything that last night might be wiped out of our memories. That is impossible. But you must not think of it, and you must not talk to me any more as you have, until we reach Adare House. And then " Her white face was pathetic as she turned away from him. "You will not want to," she finished. "After that you will fight for me simply because you are a knight among men, and because you have promised. There will not even be the promise to bind you, for I release you from that." Philip stood silent as she left him. He knew that to follow her and to force further conversation upon her after what she had said would be little less than brutal. She had given him to understand that from now on he was to hold himself toward her with greater restraint, and the blood flushed hot and uncomfortable into his face as he realized for the first time how he had overstepped the bounds. All his life womanhood had been the most beautiful thing in the world to him, and now there was forced upon him the dread conviction that he had insulted it. He did not stop to argue that the overwhelming completeness of his love had excused him. What he thought of now was that he had found Josephine alone, had declared that love for her before he knew her name, and had followed it up by act and word which he now felt to be dishonourable. And yet, after all, would he have recalled what had happened if he could? He asked himself that question as he returned to help Jean, and he found no answer to it until they were in their canoes again and headed up the lake, Josephine sitting with her back to him, her thick silken braid falling in a sinuous and sunlit rope of red gold over her shoulders. Then he knew that he would not. Jean gave a little rest that day, and by noon they had covered 20 miles of the lakeway. An hour for dinner, and they went on. At times Josephine used her paddle, and not once during the day did she sit with her face to Philip. Late in the afternoon they camped on a portage 50 miles from Adare House. There were no stars or moon in the sky this night. The wind had changed, and come from the north. In it was the biting chill of the Arctic, and overhead was a gray dun mass of racing cloud. A dozen times Jean turned his face anxiously from the fire into the north, and held wet fingers high over his head to see if in the air was that peculiar sting by which the forest man forecasts the approach of snow. At last he said to Philip: "The wind will grow, M'sieur," and picked up his axe. Philip followed with his own, and they piled about Josephine's tent a thick protection of spruce and cedar boughs. Then together they brought 3 or 4 big logs to the fire. After that Philip went into their own tent, stripped off his outer garments, and buried himself in his sleeping bag. For a long time he lay awake and listened to the increasing wail of the wind in the tall spruce tops. It was not new to him. For months he had fallen asleep with the thunderous crash of ice and the screaming fury of storm in his ears. But tonight there was something in the sound which sunk him still deeper into the gloom which he had found it impossible to throw off. At last he fell asleep. When he awoke he struck a match and looked at his watch. It was 4 o'clock, and he dressed and went outside. The wind had died down. Jean was already busy over the cook fire, and in Josephine's tent he saw the light of a candle. She appeared a little later, wrapped close in a thick, red Hudson's Bay coat, and with a marten skin cap on her head. Something in her first appearance, the picturesqueness of her dress, the jauntiness of the little cap, and the first flush of the fire in her face, filled him with the hope that sleep had given her better spirit. A closer glance dashed this hope. Without questioning her, he knew that she had spent another night of mental torture. And Jean's face looked thinner, and the hollows under his eyes were deeper. All that day the sky hung heavy and dark with cloud, and the water was rough. Early in the afternoon the wind rose again, and Croisset ran alongside them to suggest that they go ashore. He spoke to Philip, but Josephine interrupted quickly. "We must go on, Jean," she demanded. "If it is not impossible, we must reach Adare House to night." "It will be late midnight," replied Jean. "And if it grows rougher?" A dash of spray swept over the bow into the girl's face. "I don't care for that," she cried. "Wet and cold won't hurt us." She turned to Philip, as if needing his argument against Jean's. "Is it not possible to get home to night?" she asked. "It is 2 o'clock," said Philip. "How far have we to go, Jean?" "It is not the distance, M'sieur. It is that," replied Jean, as a wave sent another dash of water over Josephine. "We are 20 miles from Adare House." Philip looked at Josephine. "It is best for you to go ashore and wait until to morrow, Josephine. Look at that stretch of water ahead, a mass of whitecaps." "Please, please take me home," she pleaded, and now she spoke to Philip alone. "I am not afraid, and I cannot live through another night like last night. Why, if anything should happen to us," she flung back her head and smiled bravely at him through the mists of her wet hair and the drenching spray, "if anything should happen, I know you'd meet it gloriously. So I am not afraid. And I want to go home." Philip turned to the half breed, who had drifted a canoe length away. "We'll go on, Jean," he called. "We can make it by keeping close inshore. Can you swim?" "Oui, M'sieur. But Josephine " "I can swim with her," replied Philip, and Josephine saw the old life and strength in his face again as she turned to the white capped seas ahead of them. Hour after hour they fought their way on after that, the wind rising stronger in their faces. The seas, burying them deep.